Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. So, do you want to throw your opponent off balance right from the start? Today we are diving into surprise chess openings that are powerful, unexpected, and are fun to play. So whether you're playing as white or black, these openings can work for you. So first off, we're gonna start with the first 4 tricky openings that you can play as white. The first one is the Vienna game, including the Vienna Gambit. So in this game, we're gonna start with the king's pawn to e4, then your opponent is gonna respond with the king's pawn to e5, and then we're gonna play knight to c3, then opponent plays knight to f6, then after that we're just gonna play pawn to f4. Now this is the Vienna Gambit. Most of the time your opponent doesn't know the Vienna Gambit is gonna take this pawn, but if your opponent knows the Vienna Gambit is not gonna take, but most of the time your opponent won't know the Vienna Gambit, they take the pawn, you just play pawn to e5 attacking the knight. And in this position there's only one square that the knight can go, it's back to the original square that the knight started in. So your opponent will have two choices, either to move back the knight and undevelop their pieces, or move queen to e7, pinning the pawn to the king. And if your opponent moves the queen to e7 and pins the pawn to the king, you just play queen to e2, covering the pin. So now your opponent is losing the knight, they have to move. Now they have to go back to the original square. Then after that you're just gonna play pawn to d4. Most of the time your opponent will try to nullify the pressure in the center just by playing pawn to d6, looking for this pawn exchange. And if your opponent does that, you just ignore this pawn exchange and play knight to d5. Now you are taking the queen and at the same time threatening this fork. So your opponent will try to protect the fork. Doesn't matter if the queen moves to the d7 square or to the d8 square, you just take the pawn anyway. And if your opponent captures with the queen, you just play pawn to capture the pawn on d6 with the discovered check. Your opponent is losing the queen. Doesn't matter if your opponent blocks the check, you just win the queen with the pawn. So that's the Vienna Gambit, and that's how it's played. So you should try it sometimes and maybe win more of your games. So now let's get into the second opening. Now the second opening is the King's Gambit. So the King's Gambit plays as follows: you play your king's pawn to e4. It's the King's Gambit, so you have to play a king's pawn. So after playing the e4 pawn, your opponent plays pawn to e5 because they like to play the king's pawn also. Then after that we just play the King's Gambit with pawn to f4. Then after opponent captures, we just play pawn knight to f3. Then opponent plays pawn to d5, looking for this pawn exchange. You ignore that pawn and then play you play knight to c3. Then after opponent captures the pawn, you just capture back with the knight. And then when opponent tries to play bishop to g4, pinning the knight to the queen, you just play queen to e2. And if the bishop moves to any square, let's take the bishop moves here, because most of the time the opponent doesn't take the knight, you just play knight to f6 with a checkmate. Simple checkmate. And even if the bishop takes, even if the bishop takes the knight, you just ignore the bishop and place double check with a checkmate again. But then if the bishop may be placed here covering this check, you just play pawn to d4. Now you are ahead in development. Now you are ready to attack the king or to attack your opponent, because you are ahead in development. You have brought out your 2 knights when your bishops have been opened up. So that's how you play the King's Gambit. Now let's get into our third tricky opening, the Danish Gambit. So the Danish Gambit is going to start with the king's pawn opening to e4. Then opponent also plays the king's pawn to e5, and then now you play the queen's pawn to d4. Then after opponent captures, you just play pawn to c3, and then if your opponent captures again, you play bishop to c4. Then after that, opponent gonna see another free pawn, 3 free pawns. Your opponent's gonna capture again and then capture back with the bishop. Then after that, opponent plays bishop to b4 with a check, and then you just cover that with your knight to c3. Then after that, your opponent plays knight to f6, trying to capture your king's pawn. Then you just ignore that and then play knight to e2, and then after your opponent captures, you just castle the king side and allowing your opponent to capture your knight and go for this exchange. And after your opponent captures your knight, you just capture back with your knight, and then after that the opponent thinking that they are winning because they have a 3-pawn advantage, then he castle the king to the king side, putting the king to the safety. After that you just play knight to d5, attacking the bishop. Now the bishop has to move, then the opponent maybe is gonna move the bishop to c5, and then after that you just play knight to f6 with a check. Then the opponent is gonna see another free pawn. Of course the opponent cannot capture with the queen because it's gonna be captured back with the bishop. Then the opponent is gonna capture with the pawn, then we just play queen to g4 with a check. Now the king has to move because there's no piece that can cover that diagonal, or that, not that diagonal, that 5. Then your opponent's king moves to the h8 square, that's the only square. Then after that you just play queen to h4, trying to play this fork here with the bishop and winning the queen. Then after your opponent sees that and plays bishop to e7, you just play bishop to d3, and then the game is over. It's just mate in 2. Doesn't matter if your opponent moves the knight, doesn't matter if your opponent opens up the bishop, doesn't matter if your opponent moves the pawn 2 squares, 1 square, you just capture the pawn. If your opponent moves the pawn you just play check, and then after that, that's how you play the Danish Gambit and you've won the game. So you should also try the Danish Gambit, and also be careful to see if your opponent didn't play any other move that doesn't go with the sequence. So those are the, I think, are three openings that you can try. So I'm gonna make another video continuing with this. It's not a series, it's just openings that you could try, or tricky openings. I'm gonna make another video playing as black and showing other tricky openings that you can try. So I think that's it from this video, and I'm gonna upload another video playing as black. So thank you for watching. Please subscribe, like, comment, until we see each other on the next tricky opening video, because that's gonna be the next video that I upload. Thank you for watching again.